Hello, my amazing grade 5 artists. Today we are going to continue working on our Klee artwork. You have been working on drawing very geometric buildings inspired by our artist Klee. And you should have some basic shapes that we are going to start to fill in now with watercolor. I've decided that I want to use warm colors with a little bit of some purples as well mixed into my buildings, and a cool color for my background, which will be just the sky, and making my sun yellow will help it to communicate that it is a sun. Now we're going to be using the material of watercolor, which is honestly one of the easiest materials to use, but it can give a lot of students some confusion at first. The reason is because watercolor is in the palette, it looks dry, but actually the water wakes up our color and we don't need to use much color. It is a paint that has a lot of vibrancy to it, but when it's dried onto our paper, we want it to be translucent, which means we can see the paper through the paint. The opposite of that would be opaque. If I were to paint completely on top of it so that I cannot see the paper at all, that would be an opaque paint. So today you'll have a palette of watercolors, and it may appear messy, but actually the paints are in great condition. You'll have your cup of water, and I suggest using a broad brush that also has a tip to it. That way you can use it to get into the corners, but also it holds a lot of water to be able to spread over the entire area that you're painting. A couple of the things that we're going to experiment with in your work that you can is salt, just like the salt you put on your food, rubbing alcohol in a spray bottle, and plastic wrap, cling wrap, that we can use to create some textures for our watercolor. But let's go over quickly how we can just use our watercolor in its most basic form. And that is doing what's called a wet into wet technique. So what we do is with watercolor, my tip for success is to first start by filling in your entire shape with clear water, wetting the entire shape that you want to be filled in with paint. And then we are going to go ahead and select the color. But honestly, boys and girls, look how little I rubbed on my palette. I want just the littlest bit of paint because the water is going to wake up the paint and spread it around inside of my shape. And that's it. The water does the work. That's why I find that watercolor is one of the easiest mediums. It's like the lazy person's painting. The water is doing all the hard work for us. So again, going over, take clear water, put it inside your shape, getting all the way up against the edges. You'll notice how the tip of my brush is really great for getting into those corners, spreading along the edges. And then just select the smallest amount of paint that you need before allowing that water to move that paint around. We're creating a nice light color. I still want to see the paper through my paint. Now the next thing that you can do is, if you would like, you can start to blend and mix some of the colors together. So my yellow square here is still a little bit wet. I can take some red and allow it to mix into that yellow paint, creating some very interesting textures and color mixing options. You'll notice in this circle down here, this one is dry already, but this was the same technique that I used here for this circle. And here we have some really interesting blending of the colors together. Now let's go over some of the other ways that we can use our water. Of course, if you would like to, you can, once some of the shapes are dry, so like these two shapes are dry, I can go ahead and create another layer on top by again wetting with clear water This helps me to use the right amount of paint. And then I can take my watercolor and create a layer on top of that. Maybe I want to blend some colors together, so I can take a little bit of blue, put that on top. This is a great way to darken the colors if you would like your color to be a little bit more of a tone or a shade of the original color. That's a wonderful way to do it. Now let's go over how we can use our salt, our cling wrap, and our rubbing alcohol. So if we fill in a shape, we can go ahead and add some paint to it. And then we can take our cling wrap. Ooh, boys and girls, I did this one way too quickly. I ended up getting paint outside of the edge of my shape. We want to try to avoid that as best as we can, so do take your time. What I can do is take my cling wrap and go ahead and make it textured on top, and then I need to actually leave it until it's completely dry. This will, once it's done, create kind of a crinkled texture on top of that square. Now it has also taken it out of my shape and it will bleed out a little bit. That's okay, that's part of the technique. Now as far as the salt goes, this yellow square is ready for the salt. We don't want it to be super wet. We want it to just be a little bit damp before taking the salt and sprinkling a bit on top of it. Again, just like the cling wrap, you need to leave it to dry. The salt is going to absorb that moisture and pull the pigment into all the places where the salt has been distributed, and it will create kind of like a crystal effect. And the rubbing alcohol, very similar to both of those techniques. You can just spritz a little bit and it will draw some of that pigment into the places where the rubbing alcohol repels the paint away from it. Water and alcohol, they separate from each other, so that will make the paint a little bit more textured in those places. So you're welcome to experiment with how to create a little bit of texture in certain places. For the most part though, I think it would be best to just concentrate on using great, amazing, careful technique to fill in your shapes using your clear water and the appropriate amount of paint so that your boxes are translucent, that we can still see the paper through them. So don't focus too much on these other techniques. I really want to see that you are able to use watercolor to fill in so that we can still see the paper through your color. Whenever you need clean water, please go access clean water from the sink, but only fill up your cup just a little bit at the bottom. You don't need to make a huge mess. Watercolor can be a very clean material to use. Okay, boys and girls, I'm excited for you to get started with watercolor and really experiment with its possibilities. I hope that you are able to enjoy adding lots of color to your Paul Klee work.